Good afternoon and welcome to the Cleveland Leadership Center's special edition Leader Lunch Break. We are delighted to have lots of friends joining us for today's conversation. We know it's going to be a hot one. As you are coming into the Zoom room, we have placed everyone on mute so as to reduce background noise. We are recording today's conversation. It will be shared far and wide after we conclude the conversation across social media, and we would welcome your assistance in helping us spread it to your friends and colleagues. If you have the opportunity, we would love for you to turn on your cameras and to name yourselves so that we know who is joining us today. And speaking of naming, I'm Becky Rupert McMahon. I am the president and CEO at the Cleveland Leadership Center. And for those of you who are loyal followers, you know that our Leader Lunch Break happens on Wednesday each and every week at noon. We added this special edition because our friend Scott Skinner let us know that there was a special event coming with the release of this recent report, and we wanted to create opportunity for a special conversation. So hence the Tuesday conversation. The other change beyond just the day of the week is we're going to add an extra 15 minutes for today's conversation. So we will go until 12:45, unless there aren't any questions, but something tells me it's going to be a great conversation. About halfway through, we will move to Q&A. It might even be a little bit sooner than that. If you have questions, we would like you to share them. The way to do that is through the Q&A feature. Please stay on mute, but you can drop any questions that you have for Scott in the chat. I will be moderating the conversation today and will do my very best to move through all of the questions that we can get to in the time that is allotted.
Great.
With that, let me say that I am delighted to welcome Scott Skinner, President and Executive Director of the North Coast Waterfront Development Corporation. It's an independent nonprofit that was charged with opportunity to transform Cleveland's downtown lakefront. Scott has been in this role. He is the first executive director since March 2024. Prior to his appointment, Scott worked with the NRP Group as a VP for development. His responsibilities included deal origination, initial underwriting and due diligence, political approvals, and community outreach for both market rate and affordable multifamily development projects in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. Scott's career also includes experience as a corporate fundraiser with the Washington, D.C.-based Capital Partners for Education, also as a community organizer for the Peace Corps, and as a copywriter for sfggate.com in San Francisco. Scott earned a degree in English from San Jose State University and an MBA from the University of Michigan. My favorite aspect of Scott's background is his connection to the Cleveland Leadership Center. Since moving to Cleveland in 2018 to join the NRP Group, and let me say a personal thanks to David Heller for bringing Scott to Cleveland, Scott completed 3 CLC programs. First, the Civic Leadership Institute, our general survey course in 2019, then the Advanced Leadership Institute in 2021, and finally, Cleveland Bridge Builders in the very proud class of 2023. Our conversation today will focus on the future of Burke Lakefront Airport. As I'm sure most, if not all of you know, on March 23rd, Scott released a conceptual plan that's been built by North Coast Waterfront in collaboration with several other organizations. That plan offers a reimagining of what Burke Airport might look like in the future and how it might generate greater economic, civic, and public value as something other than an airport. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Scott Skinner to the spotlight. Scott, take it away.
Thank you very much, Becky. Appreciate the introduction. I assume you are tired of reading my bio to people by now.
I never
But
get tired of your bio.
excited to share this with you all. I'm going to share my screen here and try to, here we go, full screen mode. All right. So I'm going to walk through what is a lot of information very quickly. I'm happy to answer questions about any and all of this afterwards. And this deck is also public information. Versions of it have been presented to Cleveland City Council. They're available on the city's website as well. So feel free to go through at your own leisure. So Becky's exactly right. We're going to talk about Burke Lakefront Airport and where we think it could go. But in order to do that, we have to talk about where it's been. Where we are right now is in the middle of a bit of a community engagement exercise where we have a survey up on our website at clevelandnorthcoast.com that you can fill out and tell us what you think you would like to see on Burke in the future. And then we're also doing small neighborhood community events, neighborhood block clubs, community meetings, as well as events like this to talk to folks about Burke Lakefront Airport, and to present some of the ideas we have, but also to give you information. There's a lot of sort of misconceptions out there around what you can and can't do on Burke. So part of the goal of this is to inform you to go talk to your own networks and your own family and friends, armed with some information. So we're going to cover today a little bit of very brief update on the rest of the downtown lakefront project, some information about Burke as it currently operates, and then some recent progress made here. So while the last couple of weeks we've collectively spent a lot of time talking about the 450 acres that is Burke Lakefront Airport, there are still 50 acres of waterfront land that are in the development process as well. It's on your screen on the left. That includes 25 acres of surface parking lot north of Brown Stadium, and ultimately the footprint of Brown Stadium that is another 25 acres once it's demolished in 2029. Late last year, I brought on a group called DiGeronimo Development, local group with a national footprint as a master developer for the site. We are, as of this week, kicking off a new site planning process for the site to look at it without a stadium. And I expect, happy to come back to you all, expect this summer, July or August, to have some initial site plans to share with you all and solicit additional community feedback with the goal of whether it's infrastructure or some sort of public space work north of the stadium, with the goal of starting construction as soon as next year. On the right side of your screen is the North Coast Connector, which is a infrastructure project that is meant to better connect our lakefront to downtown Cleveland. Everything that is not in purple is fully funded. So the blue, yellow, green, and orange here is a $300 million infrastructure project funded through $150 million in federal state grants, as well as proceeds from the city's Short TIF district. This green part right here is a pedestrian-only land bridge that will start at Mall C and connect down to the water's edge. And then the Shoreway, we are bringing down to grade, slowing to 35 miles an hour, introducing signalized intersections, sidewalks, bike lanes to make it look and feel more like a city street as you're crossing over from 9th or 3rd onto the lakefront site. The first phase of this project, which again is everything not in purple, starts construction in Q4 of 2027. So we will be shovels in the ground next year. This is just an image that I like to share, sort of showing you the broader connectivity to our lakefront. It also shows you the scope of the size of Burke in context of the rest of our downtown lakefront. So what is Burke today? It's about 450 acres of land. It has two main uses, confined disposal facilities, which I'm happy to talk about if anyone surprisingly has questions, and of course, Burke Lakefront Airport. We believe this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. There's nowhere else that I can think of in North America where there are almost 500 acres of waterfront land that is in the middle of a downtown and that is owned by or controlled by the city of Cleveland. It is all contiguous land. There's no fragmented ownership, which is why it allows this really rare opportunity. You're not worrying about any private property owners sort of impeding your ability to move forward. It is solely controlled by the city of Cleveland. The site is somewhat complicated due to its status as submerged lakefront land, but it can't be sold, but it can be leased long-term and financed. The Rock Hall, Nuevo, the apartments on Voinovich, Brown Stadium, Great Lakes Science Center, all those were built on similar land. From an environmental perspective and geotechnical perspective, I like to bring this up as well. There's a lot of misconceptions out there that you can't build on Burke, but one of the really nice things about the site of Burke is we've been studying it for like 60 years. So there are very few unknowns on the site. We know everything in there, and from a real estate perspective, it is really unknowns like former heavy industrial sites that create significant risk. A lot of remediation work has been done over the last 30, 40 years. And from a soils perspective, if you have to land a plane on a runway, it actually means that soils are compacted to a degree that you can build sort of low density buildings on. And I will sort of rather than go through the tens of thousands of pages of due diligence we have on the site, I'll give you the bottom line summary, which is low density development and recreation space can be built on Burke with no unusually high environmental, geotechnical, or infrastructure costs. From an operational perspective, Burke loses about 900 grand a year. That's an average over the last 20 years. Last year, it lost 1.7 million, and that is subsidized by Cleveland Hopkins Airport. So the signatory airlines at Hopkins subsidize the operations of Burke. It brings in a little under $500,000 in income and parking taxes annually to the city of Cleveland. And when you think about 450 acres of waterfront land and what that should be driving to the city from an asset perspective, $1,000 an acre is pitifully low. Aircraft operations have been declining year over year. There's two main airport tenants. We've been in discussions with both of them, as well as all the small businesses that operate in Burke, and importantly, the Cleveland Clinic. are in, fairly detailed discussions with the clinic and with Signature around relocating some of their services, continuing to operate some of their services, and basically making sure that everyone can stay whole and that every organization, business there can continue to thrive in Cleveland, even if we look at Burke with a different land use. Most of the potential economic loss, if Burke were to close, would be the Cleveland Air Show. It's a little over 60% of Burke's annual economic impact is the weekend air show. However, we are very confident we can continue to maintain air show operations. There's lots of examples across the country of air shows that sort of operate without a waterfront downtown airport. We believe we can do it partially remote. There's also opportunities to use the future of Burke, use maybe public park space as a way to still bring visitors down to the site who can pay tickets and pay for parking and continue to support the operations of the air show. When we're thinking about the transformation of Burke, we really think about it through three key principles, and you'll see those as we go through the images here. And I guess one thing I should point out on the slide first, between Edgewater and East 55th, there are 6 miles of shoreline in Cleveland. Less than 25% of that is actually publicly accessible, and Burke represents a full third of that. Burke is 2 miles of shoreline. So the three principles through which we look at potential future uses for Burke are one, improving public access. 2 miles of shoreline, 450 acres, all privately utilized. We want Clevelanders and visitors to be able to use publicly owned land that belongs to them. The second is driving economic impact and attracting visitors. A lot of our challenges as a city are downstream of a declining tax base. That's just the reality. And we need to be thinking about how to use our biggest assets, which 450 acres of waterfront land is one, to drive visitors, to bring in both, broader economic impact to local businesses, but also direct tax revenue to the city. And then third, a financially viable model. So we don't want to go through all this work of closing Burke to then be left with future uses that need to be solely or mostly subsidized by city, county, state, or federal government. Those are not that's not a viable path to move forward. So we're looking at uses that can be both privately financed, but also offer significant public space. And one great thing about this Burke site is with all the work we've been doing on the stadium site and the downtown lakefront, we've already established tools like a new community authority and the shore-to-shore TIF district that are sort of complex, innovative public-private financing tools to help redevelop Burke. And then the last thing I'll say in this slide is I often get asked, why don't you just build out the stadium site and then focus on Burke? When we think about planning them together, a lot of additional opportunity presents itself. If we're building out significant public space on Burke, it probably provides us an opportunity to do more sort of urban, dense private investment on the stadium site and vice versa. So planning those together is something that is really important moving forward. In 10 years, if everything sort of goes the way that we think it will or hope it will, in 10 years, we won't even talk about the stadium site or the Burke site. It's just going to be Cleveland's downtown lakefront. There's three ways to close an airport. The first is to wait until 2039, when the end of all the grant obligations from the FAA closed. And after 2039, you write a letter to the FAA. It's a 30-day waiting list, and you can close the airport. There is a formal application process to the FAA to obtain permission to close Burke. That is lengthy, extensive, expensive, and just frankly, the FAA is not generally in the business of closing airports. So there's risk attached to it as well. And then the third is congressional authorization. Congress can authorize the FAA to close an airport. It did that as recently as last year for an airport in California. We are pursuing paths 2 and 3 concurrently and simultaneously. So now that's sort of where we've been. We'll talk a little bit about what we're doing right now. So we're in the middle of this sort of stakeholder engagement process. We've met with the groups that are in opposition to closing Burke. We're having ongoing discussions with the other businesses that use Burke, and are continuing to sort of plan with civic and private sector stakeholders. We have just finished the third of 4 Cleveland City Council hearings. The fourth one is next week. You can see what the topic of each of those were here. Kudos to Councilman Slife, who I think has done a really great job facilitating a really complicated conversation over these 4 hearings. And then we're in regular communication with our federal delegation and the FAA. A handful of folks are going to DC, I think, in a couple weeks to meet with the FAA, and I'm in DC on a fairly regular basis for a number of things, but this is on the agenda as well. And then, ongoing outreach and advocacy from private sector stakeholders as well as civic stakeholders is always beneficial as we think about potential for Burke closure. We're also in the middle of a public engagement campaign, like I mentioned. Just to give you context, I made this slide a week and a half ago, and we're now at 5,800 responses instead of 2,400. But we've also been doing a series of community neighborhood meetings. Generally, 70% of people just even consider Cleveland a waterfront city. 86% are supportive or very supportive of creating a more accessible lakefront. And multi-purpose trails, open park space, restaurants, sports, recreation, and play space are the sort of top five specific use recommendations. In terms of next steps, we once we have an idea of Burke, once we know that Burke is going to close and we have a timeline that is clear, at that point we'll engage sort of a more formal master planner and go through a master planning process with additional community engagement. But that's not where we're at right now. As we've been going through this community engagement, as we've been talking to our federal delegation, and as we've been talking to Cleveland City Council members, it's become clear that the idea of closing Burke without having a plan for what could go on it doesn't work. Those two things need to happen sort of at the same time. So the city asked me to lead a process going through that. So I assembled a sort of coalition, myself, city, county, metro parks, the port, Destination Cleveland, Greater Cleveland Sports Commission, Black Environmental Leaders Association, Greater Cleveland Partnership, to look at some potential uses for Burke that sort of hit those three principles. Again, public access, economic impact, and financeability. We put together two, I'll call them fit studies. So these are not master plans. Like this is not a formal master plan. This is not what we're building. We're not asking city council to adopt anything. These are fit studies to identify some uses that fit those criteria, how they would lay out on the site, and then really to start a conversation and solicit feedback. Not everyone is going to like everything on each of these studies. In fact, that's the purpose of them. So we can start to have a conversation on what is appealing to folks and what is not appealing to folks. Additionally, engage a group called ESI Solutions to evaluate economic impact of the study on these specific uses as well, to start to put some numbers around what uses like this could drive to the city of Cleveland. So this is image number one. I'm going to walk through these uses sort of west to east. The farthest west here, you have a waterfront marina. So boat slips, you can picture a promenade here, low density restaurant and shopping development, very similar to what you see on Voinovich Park. We think that makes the most sense because it is directly connected to Voinovich Park and the Rock Hall and the Science Center right here. This little tucked in corner right here is a fairly small site, but there is a growing market for, I'll call it amenitized RV campgrounds. And I know that doesn't sound like the most creative use for this land, but it represents a relatively small portion of the broader site. These are also privately financed. They're profitable businesses. And because the city controls the dirt here, we can work with potential private users and put in conditions of their lease for things like public access. Playgrounds or amenities that are built for this can also serve the general public. The third on an area or in use that takes up the most landmass is a competitive youth sports facility. So again, I think a lot of folks were surprised by this, but as we think about economic impact and how to use this land for, the youth sports is one of the fastest growing markets or businesses in the country. These competitive youth sports facilities are enormous drivers of economic development. And the Greater Cleveland Sports Commission suggests that something of this size could attract 400 to 600 families to Cleveland every weekend. Those are families that need to stay in hotels, families that need to go to restaurants, families that need to go shopping, and families that have, frankly, 4, 6 hours to kill or even overnight to kill between soccer games or hockey games or volleyball games. You have an indoor field house. I know it looks small on the site. It's just because it's a big site. This is a 7-acre building. And then a variety of multi-purpose fields throughout here, as well as some hotels on what are right now the municipal lots to serve all of these and sufficient parking for visitors. Again, 400 to 600 families every weekend to Cleveland would be transformational to our city, both from a broader economic impact perspective as well as a direct tax revenue perspective. And again, what we're pursuing here is a public-private partnership in which, on weekends, a private company, because these are privately financed businesses, a private company can host as many competitive youth sports tournaments as they like. But when there are no tournaments there, these are going to be required to be open to the general public as rec spaces for folks to use. So I've had conversations with folks who run Cleveland Pro Soccer, as well as a number of other sort of sports-oriented organizations around the city. And there is significant demand for outdoor and indoor playing fields in downtown Cleveland on a transit line. And then I'll add in all these dotted lines around here represent almost 10 miles of walking trails that connect directly into the county's trail they're constructing right here. And then in this version of the plan, you have almost 200-acre public park with wooded areas, walking trails, and a variety of hypothetical amenities. Again, this is not a final version of a plan. This is just something to sort of facilitate conversation, ideate. I should add in right here, this confined disposal facility that the port operates is a recyclable facility, which means it will continue to operate even once Burke is redeveloped. It represents about 30 acres of the land. And then this last image here, the last use here is a vertiport. So while the clinic and other healthcare users do need, runways and they can use Hopkins for that, there's still a significant need for a helicopter pad, which, takes up just 3 acres of land to get them sort of that last mile for organ transplant specifically from this location to the clinic. Second version of the plan is almost exactly the same, except rather than a public park, it includes an 18-hole public golf course. Metro Parks runs these all across the region. They in winter they sort of use them for winter recreation, winter activities like cross-country skiing. And again, as we're thinking about those three levers of public access, economic impact, and financeability, these are financeable projects. While with public space, you're likely going after philanthropy, grants, other sort of creative uses. Golf courses like this support debt and can sort of be traditionally financed. So this is again just a version where we are neither of these versions are final. This version and the other one are sort of playing with the different levers we have to try to achieve those three priorities. And then the economic impact analysis based off of these uses. First, a $600 million one-time economic impact for construction. These uses would be a 5x multiplier of the direct tax revenue that Burke currently brings to the city of Cleveland. So it would bring $2.5 million in annual tax revenue to the city. And these are fairly conservative estimates as well. Estimated at 3,000 construction jobs and 170 permanent full-time jobs. And then the three sort of bottom line conclusions of this analysis in the study were one, these uses would result in a significant increase in visitor spending. Two, they enhance Cleveland's overall competitiveness to attract new businesses and residents. And three, would likely generate a much greater economic impact or economic benefit than maintaining the current airport operations. So that, like as promised, that was a lot of information very quickly. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for right now. I can share it again if we need to look at these again. But I'm happy to dive into questions.
Great, Scott. Yeah, you are a man on fire on this project, and let me just say you're clearly the right guy to be doing this.
Thank you.
So let me start with two questions before we go to the chat questions. So first, you talked about this as feasibility study, right? This is
Yeah,
fit study. This is early concept. Let's go to the end of the game. How
sure.
will a decision ultimately be made, and who is responsible for making the decision about what happens to Burke?
Yeah, good question. So if and when we have a path and a timeline to closure, like I mentioned, we'll go through sort of a more formal master planning process. A lot of folks will remember the several years of community engagement that the city did with field operations on the stadium site, but before the Browns announced they were leaving, with a lot of community engagement. All of that will happen. In terms of formal approval, I mean, just like any development project in the city of Cleveland, this will go through design review, city planning commission. There will be, public-private financing tools that will need to be passed through Cleveland City Council. So there's no like, I guess the best way to answer your question, Becky, there's no like one person that decides what goes here. There's no five people that decides what all these different uses are going to be. It's going to be a combination of market driven, like which of these uses are ready to go and which other uses are ready to go and can be financed, as well as your sort of typical and standard public approvals process that goes through, again, City Planning Commission, Cleveland City Council, as well as a broader set of community engagement.
Aaron. And then you talked about it a little bit, but let me ask you to get more specific. So there's been 60 plus years of analysis and study.
Sure.
Why now? Why is this the right time to tee
Yep.
this up? And do you see, and do the organizations with which you are partnering see that there is going to be real appetite to make this the moment that there is a real plan going forward?
Yeah. So yes, there's been a lot of versions of plans for Burke and for the stadium site over the last 50 or 60 years. The reason for now, why this is the right time to move forward, alignment is probably the most important reason. When you are doing really hard, challenging, difficult things, like I'm sure a lot of you do in your jobs in your offices where you're calling in from, I'm sure you recognize that you often have a window of opportunity in which to be successful and in which to act. That window does not stay open forever, and we're in it right now. The fact that we have city, county, the Chamber of Commerce, the port, Metro Parks, all of the Destination Cleveland, all of these groups, not just saying that closure is important, but saying that these uses could make sense here to move forward with. That is alignment that I have not seen in my time in Cleveland, and it is alignment that does not necessarily act forever or last forever. So that is sort of the reason for the sense of urgency here as we're pushing this through. The city and the county, this is a priority both to Mayor Bibb and to Executive Ronayne. And then lastly, I'll say, the mayor's team has done a terrific job in sort of putting all of the infrastructure in place to make these things possible. So that's creating my organization. This project, both the stadium site and Burke and the North Coast Connector, is going to last multiple administrations, likely two, three, or four, and having an organization to sort of see that through and continue the work allows us to think about these long-term projects in a way that is sort of outside of politics. Additionally, the Shore to Core to Shore TIF District and the new Community Authority are both financing tools that, frankly, we should have been using as a city 30 years ago. We are the 56th new community authority in the state of Ohio, but the first one in Cleveland. TIF districts have been used in Columbus and Cincinnati for decades. These are tools that allow us to do these really hard, difficult things. Like build the non-revenue generating things that we need to build on the site, infrastructure, utilities, public space, all of those things. All of those are critically important. So I'd say alignment and sort of all of the preparatory work to be able to not just put a picture on a paper, but actually see something through to get shovels in the ground.
Yeah. So a couple of the questions are talking about the clear emphasis around recreational use, low
Yep.
density. So what about the concept of putting some fabulous high-end condos that could
Yeah.
really generate substantially more revenue through their
Yeah.
creation?
Sure. So I'll say a couple things about that. So first, the way that the site is laid out in some of these plans, you sort of have public space, green space furthest to the east, right? That doesn't preclude us for when we have a market or demand for some of these uses for building them in the future. You can also see yourself taking away two soccer fields and being able to build something there. So we are sort of thinking about this from like a phasing and sequencing perspective over the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years to sort of leave flexibility for all of that. Why not sort of dense urban development condos here right now? So specifically with condos, I'll add in because this is submerged land, you actually can never sell it. So while you can give a long-term land lease, that significantly impacts sort of the price and the market for any ownership opportunities on the site. Apartments or other uses. Again, I think there's two key reasons, right? One is going back to that sort of environmental geotechnical due diligence work. Low density development and recreation can be built with very, very limited remediation and geotechnical work. If you're talking about putting in deep foundations to build high rises and apartments and condos, that is much more complicated for this site. That's just sort of the realities of the site. It doesn't mean we shouldn't put something on it. It just means it's going to be much more expensive on a per unit basis to do that. And then the last thing I'll say, Becky, is we don't have the market here to absorb 450 acres of new construction. We just don't have enough people to do it. So as we're thinking about future uses, we do want to grow our pie. We want to use this as land that brings people into Cleveland and makes people want to stay here after they graduate college, makes companies want to relocate here. But that is still a ways off. We're still working towards that. So while we're thinking about phasing in a way that sort of leaves us open, if and when our population does grow in the future, like it has in the last 3 years for the first time in the last 50, as of right now, we just don't have the market for it.
Okay, let's talk about concept one versus concept two. So how do
Sure.
they differ in terms of impact and feasibility? And then I'll just say revenue generation in terms of
Yeah.
what economic impact looks like.
They're actually quite similar. So concept two generates a little bit more sort of economic impact and direct tax revenue because you do have people that are paying tickets and admissions to use the course. It is also privately financed. So from a cost perspective, it's a little bit sort of easier to think about, right? But again, that trade-off is less sort of wide open public access to the space. So both of of those concepts we feel sort of like hit those again those three key principles of community access, public access, economic impact, and financeability. The golf course and the park are just sort of pulling on two different levers of each of them. And again, I know I'm going to say this 1,000 times, but like these are part of this is idea generation, and all of these uses that you see in these plans, those are listed on our survey at clevelandnorthcoast.com that you can go and literally give like a thumbs up, thumbs down to the ones you like or don't like.
Fair enough. So I'm seeing reference to some other cities that have had opportunities, like Pittsburgh, like Toledo, the Glass City Metro Park,
Yeah.
which runs adjacent to the Maumee River. Has the formulation of these concepts been built at all by looking at what has happened in other communities,
Yeah.
what's been successful and what hasn't been successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll preface it with, except for maybe Toronto, 30 years ago, none of those other cities have like the scale of landmass that we're talking about here. Between the stadium site, Burke, and the Muni lots just south of it, there's like 550 acres of land, which is just that's all publicly owned, which is an enormous amount of land. So yes, we are looking to other peer cities. And the biggest sort of lesson learned there, and this is true of both the stadium site and of Burke, is that public investment and public space drives private investment and drives the market. And that's especially true in a place like Cleveland. You think of everything in Detroit Shoreway and Gordon Square that just like went off after Edgewater Park was built. You think about all the stuff down on the Scranton Peninsula that would not have happened without the Towpath Trail being built or Irishtown Bend coming in. So we do have to think about, what are those sort of those uses that open the land up to the general public that will also drive private investment. That's the lesson learned that's sort of a constant across all of those different examples.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk weather for just a second. There's several questions about Northeast Ohio's weather. So, how many months out of the year are you really thinking that we're going to be able
Yeah.
to bring families down? What are your thoughts about winter uses? There's some discussion about one of the reasons why the Brown Stadium is leaving is because of the harsh weather that comes in off the lake during those awful 3, 6, 12, no, not 12 months, but those tough months. So let's talk about sort of what the weather impact is and how many months out of the year you really think there's going to be viability down to in this new space.
Yeah. So those are all things that we're considering. I'll add in, especially with the stadium site where it's sort of more dense housing and hospitality. We are looking at there's a lot of sort of growth and innovation in like the wind analysis space. So looking at sort of designing buildings in a way that does protect you and guard you from wind without creating wind tunnels. For the Burke site, the field house that we have in there, we do see as a thing that can be active 365. We see some of the restaurant spaces down there that we're thinking about that can be active on a fairly regular basis. Metro Parks does use their golf courses for like winter activities for snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, sort of other. They do both programs and they just open it up to people to use on their own, which I think is interesting. We're also not unique in having a cold climate on the waterfront. Again, like Chicago, Toronto, Milwaukee, all of the Detroit, all of these are cities that have waterfronts and cold climates. And I think the reality is, I'm not going to answer the question directly, Becky, on number of months, but the reality is, look, in January and February, these sites in outdoor areas are not going to be super active, just like all outdoor areas in Cleveland are not super active. What you want to do is through design and through sort of thoughtful programming, you want to widen the window in which it's active. So rather than just how do you turn 6 months into 9 months, right, of the space being able to be active? And there's again both design and programmatic things to do there. I think again, a couple months a year, you're just not going to have a lot of activation there, but you do want to widen that window because at the end of the day as well, like right now, there's 0 months of activity there, right? So increasing that by one is still a net win, and in reality, we're trying to do a lot more than that.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about infrastructure. There are a number of questions about literal physical connecting this space to the west side, to Edgewater.
Yeah.
How are we going to have to think about investment in infrastructure, transportation, and more in this space under these two different concepts?
Yeah, yeah. So, I'll talk about infrastructure first. Because this is a working airport, water, sanitary sewer, utilities, electrical, that's all there. Does it need to be extended north a little bit? Absolutely. And then from a connectivity perspective, the Shoreway, the North Coast Connector project is an infrastructure project. And in thinking about connectivity and connection, part of what I think about is how do we pull like the lakefront area into downtown Cleveland? How do we create right now, if you want to get from if you want to get from downtown to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you're crossing a highway twice on East Ninth Street. How do we make that a more pleasant experience? And then from a transportation perspective, folks forget the waterfront line is here. There's just not really things to increase demand for it. When you think about, public transit, it is not very often where if you build it, they will come strategy is successful on public transit from like a multimodal hub perspective. You need to increase demand before RTA or Amtrak or any sort of transit organization can justify increased services. So how I think about transit in this site and access is that we have the infrastructure there. The line is there. There's a station there. All that is sort of ready to go. It's just not being utilized because there's not sufficient demand for that line. So if we build out the stadium site with dense housing, if we provide recreation opportunities on Burke, I do think over time you will see demand sufficient enough for an increased activation of that waterfront line.
So last Wednesday on our regular leader lunch break, we hosted Jeff Epstein from the port. And Jeff, there's a question in the chat about, has there been any conversation about using any of this land, some or all, for new port operations?
Yeah, so Jeff is on my board, so is very involved in all of this. And when he was with the city of Cleveland, was one of the folks who sort of helped create this organization. So intimately involved in all of this. Right now on Burke, there are three CDFs, which are called confined disposal facilities. So what that is, and I'll look for eyes glazing over and stop when I see them. But what that is twice a year, the port dredges Cuyahoga River. So it takes a bunch of material and debris out of the river, and that's so ships can still navigate through it. If dredge builds up in the river, you can no longer use it for sort of major shipping channels. So that happens twice a year, and they take all that dredge and they put it on Burke. So Burke is actually twice a year is getting a little bit bigger. Every single time they dredge Cuyahoga River, there are three different facilities that they put that dredge on in Burke. Two of them are almost at max capacity. They will be at max capacity by 2029. At that point, they can no longer support any additional dredge from Cuyahoga River. So for folks that don't know, Metro Parks is working on a project called Cheers, just east of Burke Lakefront Airport. And one of the purposes of that project is actually to keep disposing of dredge. So Cheers will ultimately be made of dredge from the Cuyahoga River over the next 20 to 30 years. And the reason for the need for it, aside from just having great public space, is that the port can continue to deposit dredge from Cuyahoga River safely and not just dump it into the lake. The third CDF on the site is a recyclable CDF, which means they recycle like the dredge and the dirt. Trucks come in, they take it off, and they bring them to like construction sites around the state that need a net import of dirt. So that will continue to operate. I think we and the port both believe that opening this space up for public use is a better use of it than sort of continued port operations. I should add, and I should have said this during the presentation, all of the economic impact data suggests that any other land use would provide more economic impact and more direct tax revenue to the city. If that wasn't the case, which it is, but even if it was a net neutral to close down Burke and to provide public access, it's still worth it. Right. If the economic impact of building a park is the exact same as a limited operations airport, we should still go through the process of closing Burke because there's a morality, a moral need to provide Cleveland residents access to the space.
Oh. So related to that, one of the questions in the chat is if Burke has been operating at such a loss with such subsidy, why was there even need to go through all this effort to pull together this kind of a report?
uh, you don't know what you don't know, right? I think not a lot of folks spend their time wading through municipal airport budgets. So putting together these reports to actually prove all of these things and sort of confirm hypotheses was an important piece, an important step of that. I should add in just one argument that I get often from folks, one point I get, I should say, from folks, is that if we just invested more in Burke, then ridership would increase and it would be better. It would drive more economic impact. There'd be a better use. This is a really weird place where we actually don't control our own destiny. It is not up to the city to invest more resources in Burke. It's actually up to the airlines. The five major airlines that operate at Hopkins, because Hopkins subsidizes Burke, they are the decision makers on what investments go into Burke. In fact, I think 3 or 4 years ago, the city went to those airlines and said, "Can you please repave the parking lot at Burke to make it safer?" And they just said no, right? Because the major airlines don't actually fly out of Burke. So why would they invest their resources in it? They'd much rather put their money into improving bathroom facilities at Hopkins than on additional infrastructure work for Burke. So again, to answer your question directly, we felt it was necessary for the general public to have this information in a way that's distilled and digestible. It shouldn't be on you guys to, again, comb through municipal budget line items of airports and try to find out where money's coming from where. But we wanted to make sure that the general public and Cleveland City Councils, we're talking to them, was armed with the correct information. Because it's Cleveland and because we've been talking about the lakefront for 100 years, a lot of folks think they know everything about the site, whether it's Burke's operations in their budget or whether it's environmental remediation needs. But we wanted to do the actual work and present it to folks to make sure that we're well aware, that the general public is well aware of what can and can happen on Burke and the current status of its operations.
I'm betting a lot of people didn't realize that it's up to the airlines to make those investments and instead thought it was the city. So I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
A couple questions about environmental impact. What about the environmental impact that comes from maintaining a golf course? Has there been it's a little bit in the weeds for sure, no pun intended, but what about the environmental impact that will come from the kind of rec use and or is there any additional brownfield abatement work that needs to
Yep.
be done?
So I'll start with environmental impact. None of that work has been done. And again, we are on step 7 of 3,000, right? Like that's sort of where we are in this timeline and in this process. All of that work and those operational considerations are the work that we will be continuing to do over the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years. So all those are important things to consider as we're looking at future uses for the site. Absolutely. From a brownfield remediation perspective, a lot of remediation work has been done over the last 30 or 40 years. It's just been done quietly. And again, sort of remediation work, the way that environmental work goes for development is it really depends on what you're building and on where. Are there portions of Burke that will need more remediation work than others? Sure, absolutely. If you're building a single family home, does that require significantly more remediation work than if you're building a trail? Absolutely, it does. Yes, because folks are living there. So when we think about what is needed, we think about what the ultimate use is going to be as well. And one of the reasons we're focused on sort of recreation uses is to ensure that we're not on the hook for a crazy amount of cost from an environmental remediation perspective. So that's sort of like the legal framework. And then I'll add in what we're in the process of doing right now is finishing, because this has already been done. We're just updating it. What's called a human health risk assessment. So outside of legally, can you build, houses on this land if it's remediated enough? There's also the factor of like, even if you can build something, are there other risks that we don't know about? So like if a toddler, puts his hand in the dirt and puts it in his mouth, like what is the risk there? So that work has already been completed. We're in the process of updating that. We'll be able to release that as well. But almost all of Burke, a vast majority of the site, has already received what are called NFAs or no further action notices.
Okay, we're down to our last two questions just because of time limitations. So what are we saying to the folks that are really invested in keeping Burke as an operating airport in terms of how to address their concerns? And a sub question, but one of my favorites in Cleveland, what are we
Yeah,
going to
sure.
do with the International Women's Aerospace
Oh,
Museum?
yeah, of course, yeah. So, look, are there folks who work in aviation, whose businesses operate on Burke that they would prefer to continue to do that? Of course there are, and I completely understand, right? It's reasonable. It depends on what folks are saying in terms of keeping the airport open for how you sort of talk about it. I think it's important to talk about it through the lens of this is 450 acres of land that is controlled by the city of Cleveland, so is owned by Cleveland taxpayers. And I think that Cleveland residents should have a right to that land. I also think for 450 acres of waterfront land in the middle of downtown, Burke in its current operations provides wildly insufficient economic impact to the city of Cleveland. and direct tax revenue. $1,000 an acre is laughable for direct tax revenue coming to the city for this much waterfront land. I think there's both, so to the folks who are opposed to closing Burke, I think there's both an economic and a moral case to justify closure. Like I said, we're working with all the businesses and organizations that are there to continue to make sure they can continue to operate and thrive. Burke is currently, from an office space perspective, like 80% occupied, and about half of those uses aren't even aviation related. It's just for office space. So we are looking to find new homes for all of those folks and find homes at Hopkins or at the county airport for the organizations that are aviation focused. You mentioned specifically the Women's Air and Space Museum. I have a 1-year-old daughter. I'm looking forward to taking her there in the future. So that is not closing by any means. We're deep in conversations with them and looking to provide them with a location that is frankly easier to get to and easier to find. With the Women's Air and Space Museum, if you don't know where it is, you're never going to find it. So looking to work with them to ensure they can continue to keep operating. And then I saw a couple comments pop up about the air show. Look, the air show has been around for a long time. Folks have been going to the air show with their parents and their grandparents and their great grandparents, and I completely understand the desire to keep the air show, and that is our goal. We would love to actively engage with the folks who run the Cleveland Air Show. We reach out on a fairly regular basis to find ways that they can continue to bring the air show annually to Cleveland. It's a great tradition that a lot of people love, and there are very, 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 very few cities that have an air show that operates out of a waterfront airport that's also in the middle of downtown. So I think there's lots of ways to keep it operational. We just need to engage and sort of think collectively and collaboratively about what this can look like. And at the end of the day, one of my favorite sayings with all this work is that, everyone wants progress, but no one wants change, right? And as we're thinking about moving big projects like this forward, the air show will likely look a little bit different. Can we still have it? And can it still be fantastic? Yes. Will it maybe operate a little bit differently? Yes. Same with all the folks who currently operate out of Burke. Like, will it be different to operate out of Hopkins? Of course it will. Can we still ensure those businesses can thrive? I believe we can as well.
Right. And we're just at the end of time, but I got to ask this last question, and I'm sorry, there are many more in the chat, but timeline. So if everything goes well, and if one of these concepts is the winner of the day, how many years are we looking down the road?
Sure. So it depends on sort of that FAA process versus congressional authorization to close. None of this will be quick or easy. And this is not going to happen, if tomorrow Congress voted to close Burke, you're looking at several years of sort of studies, several years of community engagement, several years of sort of the studies needed to divert air traffic to Hopkins and to the county airport to ensure all of that is safe. In fact, a lot of air traffic controllers actually are excited about the prospect of concentrating everything on Hopkins because it makes their job a little bit easier as opposed to coordinating with two different airports. So all that being said, if Congress authorized closure tomorrow, you're looking at least a couple years of studies and of work and of planning. And then I assume there's going to be a number of lawsuits that I will need to settle over time as well. I think if we're aggressive and ambitious, I think 2030 to 2032 is a reasonable timeline for shovels in the ground. I think especially and I'll zoom out, we can sort of end there from like a big market perspective as we're thinking about the growth of Cleveland. You have all the great work that Bedrock's doing down on the riverfront right now. That's going to start, it's under construction. We'll start leasing up soon, all of that. Over the next, I'd say 3 to 5 years, you have all of the work that we're going to be doing on the stadium site. That's going to be starting around then when the stadium's demolished, when the land bridge construction is finished, and we have a bunch of new product on that site in downtown. And then as that is getting ready, we have Burke coming up behind it. So we're really sort of thinking about a phasing approach and an absorption approach of all of this land and infrastructure work that's going to be done over the next 10, 15, 20 years. As of right now, the stars are fairly aligned. We just need to keep our foot on the gas.
Absolutely. Well, if ever there's a time to get this right, this is it. And let me just say, Scott, I think that you are clearly the right guy to be leading this
Thank
charge.
you.
Thank you for your transparency and your directness in your responses, and keep the conversations going. These stakeholder conversations, as I know you've already figured out, are essential. And let me just say thanks to everybody who joined us today. Again, we would welcome your help in spreading the news as we post the link to today's presentation far and wide. There's a lot of great information here. Parts of this I'm going to have to listen to again because the only person who talks faster than I do is Scott Skinner.
That's right.
But please join me in thanking him. Lots of applause. Kudos to you, Scott.